everybody joining me? Yeah? Okay. Because we're going to be setting up for a private Victorian here, so the doors are open for the Yeah. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maureen, and I'm going to be giving you a talk this afternoon about Rothschild and how they became involved in wine. So does anybody here have house entry tickets over the next... No? Okay, that's fine. If you need to go, then just go. I won't be offended. But if you want to take a seat, there are a few seats left there. And if you would really like a seat, we could always bring another bench through if anybody wants to, or if you're happy standing. Okay, right, okay, so has anybody not been to Waddesdon before? Not been to Waddesdon, right, okay, so for those that welcome to Waddesdon, for those of you who've been before and you're visiting again, welcome back, lovely to see you, thank you for coming at Christmas. And as I say, what I'm going to do is talk this afternoon about how the Rothschild family became involved in vineyards and wine generally. So you probably know that the house was built by Ferdinand de Rothschild, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be doing this because the statue gets in the way a wee bit. Anyway, so the house was built by Ferdinand de Rothschild, and the foundation stone laid in 1877, the first visitors stayed here in 1880. So built in the Victorian era, made to look like a French chateau, and you will have been through parts of the house today that reflect 18th century France and parts of the house that reflect a much older period, Renaissance and medieval. But it was actually Ferdinand's great-grandfather, a gentleman called Mayor Amschel, who was born in the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt in 1744. At the time, Jews were only allowed to be involved in certain occupations, anything connected with usury, so coin importing, exporting, and dealing with bonds, and anything generally connected with money. And Mayor Amschel subsequently met and married a young lady called Gutelschnapper, by whom he fathered 19 children. Cool. Excellent, thank you very much. It never fails to get some kind of reaction. Yeah, 19 children. Of the 19, 10 survive. 5 sons represented by the 5 arrows, and 5 daughters. And it was only sons that were involved in the business. Daughters were very much kept in the background at that time. We'll come on to that a little bit later. Also at the time in the ghetto, they didn't have house names and numbers as such that we would perhaps have today and recognise. Rather, they had a plethora of signs. So if you were a tailor, you might have reel or a needle and thread as a sign outside your house to indicate what you actually did. And the house where Mayor Amschel spent his formative years had a red shield. And for those of you who know a little bit of German, you will know that the word for red shield is Rothschild, Rothschild. So subsequently, when the family, having lived in the Jewish ghetto for some time, had made a little bit of money, they perhaps now moved more into the middle classes. They decided to move house, which they did in the 1840s, and they moved to another part of the ghetto. They moved to a house that had a green shield outside, would have been green shield. But because the name Rothschild was already well established, they kept the name. So Rothschild has gone all the way through. So it was Mayor Amschel who had the vision and the foresight to think, if what he was doing in Frankfurt could be replicated across Europe, that possibly might make some money for the family. So the 5 sons, as I say, were sent across Europe. So we have James, who went to Paris, Nathan to London, Carl to Naples, Salomon, who was Ferdinand's grandfather, to Vienna, and Amsel stayed in Frankfurt. And it's mostly the French and the English side of the family that we're going to concentrate on, because it was as a result of setting up a financial bond for the then Elector of Hesse-Kassel that Mayor Amschel's financial reputation started to precede him. And this is what gave him the brainchild about, well, if I can do it here, then we can do it across Europe. So having done that, he's got the sons set up in the various locations. They would communicate with each other by means of telegrams. And if the figures were in red, it indicated that the share price had gone up, it was getting hotter. If they were in blue, they'd gone down and come back. They also used racing pigeons to make sure that they could get messages around. So we then come to the Napoleonic Wars. So during the Napoleonic Wars, James, who was in Paris, put up money and bonds for Napoleon and his army and his supplies and etc., etc. And Nathan, who was in London, did exactly the same for Wellington. So, you're well ahead of me. So at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the family, by the French and the English side of the family, had made quite a bit of money. So it was after the Napoleonic Wars that the family decided they needed to diversify. What were they going to do with this money? And so they decided there were two areas that they concentrated on in the main. One was railways and the other vineyards. So the area that we're actually going to talk about is the Dordogne and around Bordeaux. Has anybody been to that area, southwest France? Excellent, lovely. Watered by the Gironde River, which is 60 miles long approximately. It's also an area where the Romans introduced viticulture to that area way back. And we know from records dating back to the 12th, 13th century, there were regular consignments of claret being sent across from France to England. We also know people like Louis XV and his amorous dinners à deux with either Madame de Pompadour or Madame de Barry would have claret from this particular wine-growing area. So names such as Lafite, Entre de Mer, Saint-Emilion, or Medoc, Margaux were already established vineyards in this particular area. And we also know that, for example, the word claret comes from the Latin word clarus, meaning clear. And we know also mouton, as you probably, those who've got a smattering of French probably know it as the word for ram, but it's also an old French word for hill, because again, the area that we're talking about had lots of hills. And I also will add on that Lafite, also old French word for hill. So we're talking about this area that's got lots and lots of ups and downs and already has a smattering of vineyards there. And in 1834, the Lafite vineyard came on the market. James, who was in Paris, heading up the Paris branch of the Rothschild Bank, was known and renowned for always buying the best. And he thought, well, you know, I have a wonderful art collection, I'm going to put in a bid for the Lafite vineyard. To his annoyance, he wasn't successful. We fast forward 17 years, and another vineyard, the other side of the hill, to Lafite, comes on the market by the name of Mouton. And Nathan in the London branch decides, oh, I think I'd quite like to have a vineyard. So he puts in a bid, and he is successful. As you can imagine, James was not particularly impressed. 2 years later, in 1855, the French government recognises that they now have quite a few vineyards in this area, and they have no way of accrediting the quality of the wine. And so they introduce what we would now know as appellation contrôlée. And Lafite, and I mentioned Saint-Emilion, Entre de Mer, Orgueillon, Margaux, were already established wines. So Nathan thought, well, I might as well submit my wine, and hopefully, like the others, it will come out as a Premier Cru. You probably know what I'm going to say next, because unfortunately it didn't. It came out at the top of the deuxième class, but that wasn't good enough for Nathan. He was a little bit miffed, a bit like James might have been a few years earlier. So he took an old French saying and he amended it to reflect how he felt. And the saying goes, I'll do it in English rather than boring you with my French accent, but anyway, the saying goes, first I cannot be, second I do not wish to be, mouton I am. We'll come back to this saying in due course. So this is, as I say, in 1855. Then we fast forward to 1868, some 34 years after Lafite first came on the market and James put in an offer for the vineyard. And again, Lafite comes on the market. James is determined that at all costs he is going to buy Lafite vineyard, which he does. He is successful and he buys the vineyard. He pays 3 times the going rate to buy it. And we're talking lots of noughts. Within 6 months, he died. Oh. Yes. Now, he had 4 sons. And if you remember, I mentioned at the beginning that only sons were able to be involved in the running of the business. So, of the 4 sons, Solomon does not inherit a quarter share. The other 3 brothers have a third each. Why do you think Solomon wasn't able to have any shares in the vineyard. I'm very mean to do this to you on a Sunday afternoon.
Illegitimacy.
Well, that's a very good point, but it wasn't. But it's a good try. No, it's because Solomon had 2 daughters. And the concern was that if the daughters subsequently married outside of the family, they would have been taken the shares out of the Rothschild family, which they didn't want to do. So he wasn't able to have a share. I guess he must have been recompensed in some other way, but he didn't have a 3rd share of the vineyard. And it's actually from the French side of the family that the current Lord Rothschild actually has a 6th inheritance share of Lafite. And Lafite has continued to go from strength to strength. And if you've had a look at the video or going to look at it afterwards, you'll see that now Baron Eric heads up the vineyard there, and it's still very, very successful, and is still a premier cru. So we're going to concentrate on the Bray Mouton vineyard that Nathan purchased in 1853. The first thing he does is to change the name from Bray Mouton to Mouton Rothschild. And the vineyard continues to sort of, make some very good inroads. It's still, don't forget, a deuxième place. It's not a premier cru. And then we come to 1922, when, again, a young French gentleman, Baron Philippe, from the French side of the family, wakes up on his 21st birthday to discover he has inherited the Mouton Rothschild vineyard. Now, he's only a young man, he's 21, he likes, wine, women and song, fast cars and all the rest of it. And somebody is saying, well, here's a vineyard. Now, at the time, the vineyard needed quite a bit of money spent on it, needed quite a bit of work. And he was a little underwhelmed as to whether or not he really wanted the responsibility, but he enjoyed a challenge. So he said, yeah, that's fine, thank you, I shall look forward to this. So one of the first things he did was to build this huge warehouse, or barn, it's called the Grand Chai, which actually had capacity for 1,000 barrels of wine. Because up until that stage, what would happen after the vines and grapes had been picked, trampled down into liquid form, it was then put into casks and then taken to a local village, town, where it was bottled and labelled. And Baron Philippe thought, hang on a minute, it's a potential loophole here. I could be losing a cask or a barrel. Oh look, it's fallen on the floor, sir. And yes, possible shrinkage. So he decided if he actually built a warehouse to keep all the casks in, he would actually bring in-house the bottling and the labelling. So he was the architect of what we would call chateau bottling. So the first year that he had the Grand Chai, which was 1924, he decided to ask a young graphic designer at the time, the name Jean Carruades, to design a label. I'll let you have a look. And I'll pass it around in a moment. He designed this very modern cubist design, which became very iconic. It's got the ram's head, the 5 arrows, and the wine, and has become very successful. And I'll just let you just take that round and show it round to everybody. So this was in, as I say, this is in 1924. So the vineyard continues to do quite well. And then in 1933, Baron Philippe decides that although his wine is still only a deuxième cru, it's probably still quite expensive for the everyday man in the street. So what he decides to do is to introduce a slightly lesser wine, which he calls Mouton Cadet, i.e. son of Mouton, which you can buy in the wine shop here. And it's still going very strong. It's like a bread and butter line. It's good quality wine for everyday drinking, and it's done very well. And then we come to the Second World War. During the Second World War, this particular part of France was not bombed or strafed in any way, because the Germans liked their wine too, and they obviously were occupying France. They had a vested interest, so it remained unscathed. And at the end of the Second World War, again, Baron Philippe felt this was another opportunity to perhaps celebrate the end of the war, and asked another young poster designer by the name of Philippe Julien to design another label. Unfortunately, I don't have it on that card, but it has the famous Winston Churchill V for Victory sign on it, and again is quite well known. And sales did very well. And it was at this point, okay, to a certain extent, it was the relief that the war was over, etc., etc. But I think it also, again, provided another marketing opportunity. and Baron Philippe was pretty good at picking up on this sort of thing. So he then decided, well, I know some friends of mine who are artists, perhaps they'd like to design some wine labels. So he asked people like Dali, Chagall, Picasso, and Kandinsky, and other well-known artists, to design labels. And every year since 1946, an individual wine label has been designed, and you'll see the display on the wall behind you. If you go into the wine shop, you'll actually see there is a huge wall chart that you can look at. You can also go online at www.rothschildwines.com, Rothschild, and you should be able to see all the labels that are there. So, as I say, it's become quite a thing. And in fact, in 2004, Prince Charles also designed a wine label. It is on display, but unfortunately, because of the Christmas decorations, it's in the kitchen corridor, you can't actually see it at the moment, but it is there. So, as I say, year after year, labels have been designed, and that continues. We then have, as I say, so this was at the end of the Second World War, and we then fast forward to 1973, by which point there are lots and lots of vineyards in the southwest area of France, and again the French government realised that they haven't done a stock take for quite some considerable time, and they undertake to do another accreditation. And the good news is this time round that, in fact, Mouton Rothschild did actually come out as a premier cru. Hooray, 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 118 years after